Our second speaker tonight, in his own words, explains his trajectory better than I can, so I will borrow his words. For the rest of the time, I hope he will speak his own words. He says that he spent 51 years between two companies, that between them, one of them is the most Indian multinational ever, and the second is most multinational Indian company ever. One of them is Hindustan Unilever's, the second is the Tata Group. Together, he has spent 51 years in those companies, half a century. Now, those are companies that are not just corporations. They are pretty much part of the fabric of our everyday life. I would wager that every one of us here has been touched by these corporations in some ways. What does it take to set up not just companies, but companies that become part of the fabric of a society? What can corporations do in a society? What must they do in a society? What is their role in nation building? And what is a leader? That's a fabulous place to start this conversation from. Mr. Gopalakrishnan, as I mentioned, he was, of course, a vice chairman of HUL when he left at 31 years. Then he spent the next 20 years with the Tatas as a director on the Tata Sons board and multiple board companies. He has also authored 9 books and counting. But unlike a lot of self-help books, his books really translate his journey into the kind of wisdom that can only be lived, never learned from outside that. He is an advocate of experience over concept. Most of us learn life the other way around. We learn concepts and we see whether our experience matches. He spent his life living that out and then telling the tale. Mr. Gopalakrishnan, may we have you up on stage, please? Thank you for being here. If I could start by asking why your most recent book, and I'd like to just start from that but move into other areas, was Doodles on Leadership, I think. What have 51 years in 2 iconic companies taught you about leadership? Can you distill that for us?
I always knew Payal will start me off on some challenging question. 51 years in a few minutes. I am visualizing a career, a corporate career, in my case, as like climbing the Qutub Minar. And the stairs get narrower, they get higher, and you pant as you go up. But periodically you come to a balcony. And from that balcony, you look down at what you're seeing. But when you go to the second balcony, the third balcony, they are very different. And what I've learned now, when I think back at my career, is your first balcony is the transactional level. You learn how to run a factory or how to run a sales unit or whatever. In the second balcony, you're running a corporate level job where you've got conflicts of views from different people. You have to resolve them and make them do the work. But in the third balcony, you wonder not what's in the job, but what is this job a part of? What is the role of the company in society? And that is the summary that I can offer. It is, you get a bit more philosophical, not just because you're getting older, but because of what you're doing and what you're thinking about. Age helps.
And I wanted to ask, because you alluded to this when you say, what is the role of a company in society? I think traditionally it was believed that the company has one role, which is essentially maximizing shareholder value, right? And we are now seeing that as part of a fallout of that, we have environmental crises. We have a whole manner, we have workers' rights that are often compromised. That model is myopic. But it is not just myopic for society at large, it's also often myopic for companies, right? Why do you believe that enlightened companies are not just better for society, they're also better for business? Is that true or is that not true?
No, I mean, enlightened companies are good for themselves and for business.
How are they good for themselves? Society. I think for society it's evident that they would be. How are they good for themselves?
Because a company is like a child in your house. It is born, or a founder sets it up with the hope that it will live long. Nobody sets up a company. Well, there are a few guys who seem to do it today to sell it quickly in 5 years' time and walk off with some money. But most people set up a company or an enterprise so that their children can run it or their grandchildren can run it, it will become bigger and so on and so forth. That's why it's like the health that a human being or a child is inculcated with. You must have good habits which are socially and economically relevant. And that, to my mind, is the overarching reason why companies are also like human beings. And you can't have a human being who is completely you can have, but if he's completely selfish and self-centered, I call these three balconies. Your first journey, part of your journey is you're concerned with Swayam. What is in it for me? When will I get a promotion? When will I get a bigger car? Your next one is you're looking at the society around you. But finally, you're coming to what I call Manav. And what can I do for humanity? It sounds a bit idealistic, the way companies actually behave, but that's the way it should be. That's the point I want to make.
And I'd like to come back to that strand, but first, just to talk a bit about your time between these two iconic institutions. What to you is the defining difference between a company like HUL and a company like Tata? What are their individual strengths, but also that core distinction that makes them entirely different parts of your trajectory?
I'm a prejudiced guy. I'm talking about the two companies I worked in, and I can't talk of a third company because I've luckily or unluckily not worked in any other company, but I'm sure there are others. But just like a child who grows up in a family and you say that my family values have come to me, I think these two companies represent very high values. They also represent aberrations, by the way, behavioral aberrations, which you read about in the newspapers. So one does not take away from the other. And to be specific, as an example, 130 years ago, Lord Leverhulme, as he was called, William Hesketh Lever is the real name, was asked, why do you brand soap and sell it around? He said, there are teeming millions all over the world who need to be cleaned. And I am going to do this for a long, long time. Make people cleaner so that they can have longer life. Now, the connection between hygiene and life was a huge leap if you think back of 1880s. Likewise, when Jamshedji Tata set up his enterprises, he said that company is not separate from society. It is the very reason why the company exists. I think those are values which are playing out in day-to-day living, as I've experienced in my 50 years. And to me, that's the most valuable thing.
So, in your experience, in what ways are the two companies different?
Oh, in many ways.
Will you give us an example?
Just like two brothers they look similar to other people, but they are quite different.
And the reason I ask, of course, they're both, to that extent, behemoths. They're both, they dominate their domains. They carry great prestige in society, both to work at as well as, customers hold them in great esteem. But what distinguishes the companies internally? What was your experience that would be different between both? In what ways?
So that I don't go off into a long answer, one is very Anglo-Saxon, one is very Indian. So you may say, well, what the hell does that mean? In the Anglo-Saxon way of leading your life and thinking, it is principally influenced by Greek philosophy. The Indian way of looking at things is influenced by our philosophy, which Rohan Murthy is trying to sort of do something about. Example, in Greek philosophy, it says, separate the world into good and bad. There's a very thin line separating it. Indian philosophy says, its world is ambiguous. What is good and bad depends. And so, Indian ways of working are quite ambiguous. Whereas an Anglo-Saxon way of working is, they rewarded me, because I suppose if I progressed in Unilever, it is because I became Anglo-Saxon in the way I worked in my company. They rewarded me for sorting out all the distractions and figuring out what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. Whereas in Tata's, or in any Indian company for that matter, they will still reward you for that. I don't want to suggest that they don't care for it, but they recognize that there's a lot of ambiguity. So take a subject like ethics. In Unilever, if you fudged your expense statement for even 10 rupees, you're fired. In Tata's, they'll say, did he really fudge it? How do we know? And if he or she fudged it, were there certain circumstances? Can we give a lesser punishment? Now, I can't say one is right and one is wrong, but I've experienced both. And I can go on and on with examples like this, but I hope that gives the answer to your question.
You've written and spoken of the role of intuition in business and in leadership. Will you tell us why you would think that corporate life in particular, and Rohan was alluding to say process, we think that the idea often becomes to institutionalize process and reason and method. When you make a case for intuition in business, what is it that you really are saying?
No, each of my books came out of some epiphanic experience, and this is the first book I wrote, and it came out of an epiphany I had when I was chairman in Unilever Arabia in Jeddah. In order not to hog the time of what that problem was that I was trying to solve, I was faced with a business situation where all the statistics and the facts told me one thing. But when I walked around the marketplace, I got the opposite impression. And I was challenged to figure out what I should do. And that's what caused me to study the subject of intuition. And I came to the following views, to summarize. That we think of intuition and rationality as being competitive. But actually they are on the same linear path. It is right to use rationality as far as you can. But after a certain stage, rationality doesn't give you any more answers. And you have to fall back on intuition. Example, whom should I marry? If you try to do that with great rationality, and you try to keep that marriage alive by being rational, then you're nuts. It's not going to work. So you say that I want a girl who's like this or a boy who's like that. Finally, you've got to have that jazbat. And then you say that this is the person I will marry. So that's what I mean by continuum of intuition with rationality. So that's one thing that I found. The second thing I found is the higher you go in an organization, the mix of rationality and intuition changes. When you're low down, it's much, much rational. Do analysis, do PowerPoint chart. As you come up in the balconies, the views are different. You must have a horse sense for people, for whom you associate with, for whose advice you will take. Those come out of intuition. And many CEOs, at the transition time to being a CEO, miss this subtlety. And if you over-rationalize when you're at a very senior level, you may become a analysis paralysis character. And if you start using too much intuition when you're lower down, you may become a bluff master.
You've studied leadership, and I'd like to ask, what is it that to you defines, or defines maybe too narrow a word, but of the great leaders you have known, personal leaders, or it could be political leaders, are there strands that are common to all leaders? They can be successful in different ways, but are there traits or attributes that all great leaders have, and what would you say are those?
Frankly, it's a very good question. I think whether it's in politics or in business or in arts and science, the common characteristic amongst great leaders is that they have followers. I know it sounds like a self-evident thing, but we tend to forget it.
So let's put it this way. Who do people in your experience like to follow?
I think people who follow voluntarily any person are doing so because there's something about what that person is saying or doing which you like, and you don't have an inhibition. You're not forced to follow. So people say that, how can you say that even Hitler was a great leader? I don't think there were lots of people who were voluntarily wanting to follow Hitler. People might have been bludgeoned into submission. Take Gandhi. When he stood on the deck planks in the boat in 1915, when he came back, he had no followers. But then things panned out, and we all know the history of what Gandhi did, and he had lots of followers. So I think I once asked a naval, I think admiral or somebody, how does he judge a good ship? And he told me that I look at the wake of the ship. So I said, what the hell does the wake of a ship mean? And he said, the wake of a ship is the trail it leaves in the water after the ship has moved forward. I see the effect of that ship. I once asked Ramanathan Krishnan, how do you spot a good tennis player? Because I've always watched the swing of the racket and the shoulder structure. He says, no, you must look at his feet. I said, why should you look at his feet? He says, you look at the person's feet, because if his feet are not in place, nothing else is going to work. Very few people observe the feet of the tennis player. And so this is exactly the same I found in my business experience. If you see a leader and you see the effect he's had on his follower. I would really do the appraisal of a great leader only after he's left that department or that company. And do people throw up their straw hats and say, whoopee? Or do they say, oh my God, that was a wonderful time? That's the real message.
And I think one of my purposes of asking the question is it's often easier to spot leaders at the top, right? And I imagine that this is part of the challenge for companies, how to spot the people whose potential makes them great leaders. So the obvious leader already exists. What are those strands you would look for in somebody that show they have the potential to be great leaders in the future?
Well, it's a good question, but may
I have a feeling that anytime somebody tells me it's a good question, they have no intention of answering it.
Well, you'll find out in a minute. I just want to say that we think that we can easily spot leaders who are at the top. That's not true.
Okay.
If it was true, so many CEOs won't be getting fired. I am a survivor. I have not been fired. But I know how perilously close I might have come. And anybody who's been a CEO in this audience can confirm what I'm saying. But coming back to how do you spot the talent, what I have found helpful, it's a modest answer, but it's the truth, is to see what is his effect on other people. And some people are shy and reflective. Some people have a grandiose and grandiloquent way of delivery. Some people make fantastic PowerPoint presentations. Some people look at their notes and they seem to fumble. But if you look at what effect they have on the department or the company or wherever they are working, you get a much better feel. Usually we don't look there. Usually bosses look at how impressive you are. And that's a mistake that I have also made, and we all make.
Will you, and we were talking about this at the start, and I'd like to come back to it, which is you believe that companies can be involved in the process of nation building. And I assume you mean beyond the obvious sense of obviously their economic impact, their impact on jobs. What is it that you think is a role a good corporation can and should play in a society? What is its role to society, its obligation to society?
Its obligation to society is to play the role that society has asked you to play, which is to be a trustee. Gandhiji used the word trusteeship, and I'm no Gandhian, I'm no scholar on Gandhi, but at least I worked in 2 companies which practiced trusteeship. So as a little pup when I joined, I think I've seen a bit of it and learned it.
It may be a very obvious question. Would you explain what you mean by trusteeship in this context?
Trusteeship is the attitude of saying, I just happen to be here, I'm like a pipe, and the water must flow or the milk must flow through me to somewhere else, and I'm delivering that. So if you're making a lot of profit, like Jamsetji Tata was told, Jamsetji Tata said, I'm in it because of the community, and if we make profit, it belongs to the community. The man who bought my car or steel or my aeroplane ticket must get it back in some way. It must be recycled. That is, to me, the essence of trusteeship. And it is very interesting in both these companies, the 2 founders, William Hesketh Lever and Jamshedji Tata left all or much of their wealth in trusts. And those trusts are the ones which are doing the charity work and so on and so forth. So, to me, that form of trusteeship, society can trust you with your strengths and your aberrations, because there's no perfect person in the world. I think it's a lot. And that's what I've seen, I've experienced, and I think it's very nice if it can happen.
I wanted to come briefly to corporations, and when we talk about corporations in society, when we look at the current state of affairs in India at this moment, the nationwide protests that are, and no matter where one stands on the spectrum, it is evident that there is tremendous unrest over the particular policies on, say, CAA and NPR and so on. Corporate India has been strategically silent. We haven't heard a single voice. Cinema, also often known to be silent, has now spoken out. I think sport is one of the areas still very silent. These are all influencers in society, but companies, as you say, are stakeholders. I'm not asking the question about a particular company, because we're asking about corporate responsibility as such. What is the corporate's responsibility to engaging with citizenry outside of its business? Do they have an obligation to society in a civic sense?
I think they do have, and that's what we've been talking about all this time, whether it is through rural development around their factories, promoting schools where there are no schools, etc. But I think the corporation must be very clear that it cannot be operating like an individual citizen. It must do good to society while taking care of itself also. And I think one of the reasons why corporate leaders hesitate to speak up, I'm not cribbing about the mahal in which they are working, which one can crib about as well, but I'm leaving that aside, is if I speak up, will it harm my company? And if it can harm my company, do I have the right to harm my company? I'm only a trustee. That's certainly been my experience. Very often I'm asked this question, that corporate India is very selfish, and they only ask for tax breaks and so on. That there are elements of selfishness cannot be disputed. But I don't think you can expect a corporate chief, chairman of a company, to go out and talk about CAA, NPR, caste system, which party won in which place. It is bound to invite repression on the company.
I didn't mean to suggest company leaders in their individual capacities, but for example, when you gave the example of trusteeship, say company boards, companies making a statement, not an individual, but or a point of view, or engaging with citizens. Do you believe that's an obligation? And would you, for example, have liked to see companies come out and speak about the current issue as companies, not as individuals?
No, there's no, according to me, there's nothing called a company to speak. I've never come to a speaking company. If the CEO speaks,
it is.
So if you're the managing director of XYZ company, and that company is important, then people will listen to you. But what your old profession will do is to report that Gopalakrishnan said this. It may at best say Gopalakrishnan of Tata said this. You see what happened to Rahul Bajaj, right? So I think I'm not able to discriminate between the company and its CEO, because the way the atmosphere is. And I don't think a CEO has the right or the obligation to do things which will harm 20,000 people, or in the case of Tata, 700,000 people who work in the group. And I think that balance has to be found. Whereas if you're I don't know if you're a cricketer, I'm not being light-hearted about cricketers. If you want to speak your mind, you speak your mind. Nobody can stop you from scoring a century in the next match. Or if you're a film star, you produced a fantastic film, nobody can stop your film from running.
Well, Deepika Padukone is finding out to the contrary. But
I don't know if she's finding out to the contrary. The movie has hardly started.
Yeah, I take your point. I take your point. I wanted to, and I just wanted to come back to this, but first to say you've made an interesting point somewhere about India-born managers, and partly I wanted to come to the role of culture in leadership. You've said that India-born managers, you believe, have some unique strengths that actually make them impactful or potentially impactful on a world stage. What would you say are those strengths? What about being an India-born corporate leader better equips you on a world platform?
You know what we all crib about growing up, anybody who's grown up in India knows that you're constantly solving problems. Initially, your parents do it for you, then you do it for yourself. So to get a birth certificate is tough. Then to get a school admission is tough. Then to pass the exams is tough. To get a job is tough. When you die, in Bombay, you cannot be cremated if you can't produce the Aadhaar card of that person. Can you believe it? It's terrifying to say, find your grandmother's Aadhaar card.
Or bring her back to life, make it, and then...
So, the point I'm making is that we all know from our own experience that we grow up overcoming problems all the time. A good manager is a person who can overcome problems. And therefore, we spend a lot of our time and energy. I think Indians are very creative. I don't agree with those who think we are not. We may be criticized for being creative and short-term problem solution, but we are creative. If you're not creative and hopeful, you can't live in India. It is not possible to live with any sanity. If you want to be insane, that's a separate matter. So I think Indians are culturally adaptive. We are always problem solving. Because of the number of languages and religions, and the number of food types, we are constantly changing. And this is what a good top-class manager requires to do. It is not enough. It is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. And therefore, I think when a lot of the energy that Indians spend is dissipated in frictional forces, overcoming the obstacles. I remember I was a director of Hindustan Lever, and my whole day, or a large part of my day I used to be the director for exports, was going and booking trunk calls to speak to my customer. Now, when I went to Saudi Arabia, I had no difficulty. I just picked up the phone and punched a few buttons and it worked. A lot of my energy was then available for me to put into more productive things. And I do think, while it is possible to challenge the point of view that Indian managers in a global context, Indian-born managers, I'm not talking of Indians who are born and raised in America because they don't have these issues. We are seeing many people have success. It's not a coincidence that there's a Shantanu Narayan or a Satya Nadella or all our Indian compatriots who are there. It's a great help. I've compared Indians with Brazilians, or take the BRIC countries, Russians, Brazilians, Chinese. I think Indian managers in global corporations are reasonably successful. I would not say there's no proof to the contrary, but I think they are. And this is the reason. And I wrote a book on it.
I wanted also briefly to touch on entrepreneurship, and I think because you were alluding to problem solving, which seems to take up so much of our energy. What is it that you think we hear repeatedly, and we also see startup culture is really, this city in particular is a hub of it, but the startup culture, which is now encouraged widely and yet finds itself stymied at so many levels, what really will it take, in your view, to unleash not just the entrepreneurial gene, because the gene is there, but its impact in this country, small town, big town? What do you think holds Indian entrepreneurship back? Can we build those super companies that we seem to have built, that globally are getting built, or that we ourselves seem to have built, companies like the Tatas? We built 100 years ago, 150 years ago. Can we build those companies today?
You know, there are two boxes in which I see the answers. One box I don't want to talk about, that government should make business easier, because then you can go on and on the whole evening about that, so I don't want to talk about it. The second is a mindset change that our entrepreneurs require. One of the consequences of being in a permanent 24/7 problem-solving mode is you become a jugaad expert. And you are solving that problem in a patchwork so that it works for the present, but not in a design thinking way,
Sure.
structural and strategic. And unless we change that, we are not going to have entrepreneurship at the level that you are referring to. We will have all this stuff. So if you see Amazon is doing something, you can copy Amazon and make a Flipkart here. I'm not, for a moment poo-pooing the accomplishments of Flipkart. I can argue whether it's worth $16 billion, but that's a separate subject, so we won't go into that. We are dependent on other people's money to make us copy other people so that we can make a quick buck. And if you look at the history of the Tatas or the Hindustan Levers and other such companies, that's not how they came up. We want to incubate our companies to become very valuable in a very short time, and this word called unicorn has been invented. It's like saying the Russian finance minister was asked when Glasnost and Perestroika began, why can't we move faster? He said, listen, if I put 9 women into a room, the babies won't come out faster. Each one will take 9 months. And that is true of innovation and entrepreneurship as well. So you build and then move, build, make a little profit, not to make a profit for 20 years, 15 years, and working on Chinese money to do that is not the way I think Indian entrepreneurship should go.
And I know we will soon run out of time, but I wanted to come to two conversations. One, you spoke of time in particular, and you've said somewhere, and I haven't heard that framing from business leaders in particular. You spoke of time as being inelastic, and that there's such a thing as spiritual time, as mind time, as psychological time. What did you mean by that? But also, what is its role in business thinking, that kind of relationship with time?
The most common response you get, my children or my grandchildren and everybody's children and grandchildren, is, I don't have time to do this. And that caused me to think, and it happens in offices as well, that there are 4 kinds of time. There's clock time. So you have a good Titan watch and you look at it and you say, well, got another 15 minutes. That's clock time. And that is short. But there is the mind time, because this clock runs at a different pace. And so there is mental time. So if I'm watching a lovely movie for 3 hours, I'm completely absorbed in it, I don't feel 3 hours have gone. If I'm watching a terrible movie, it feels like it's 30 hours and I want to walk out. That's what I mean by mental time. There is then psychological time, which is overtones of emotions. I want to very much date this girl or this boy. The evening passes so well. But when I meet her mother, the evening seems to drag on. These are emotional side. And then there is spiritual time, which is ekanta, when you're by yourself. How does time go? So there are 4 types of time. And I think what really moves the world is not clock time, but the other 3. If you look at the great people who have changed this world, it is the other 3 types of time. And I think I like to think of it that way, as to the small extent that one has practiced it, helping you to do things which are quite extraordinary from somebody else's point of view.
Because the bell did go off, we are out of clock time, but hopefully not out of the other 3. But I did have a question about something that's part of your personal journey, and that's in a very interesting project that I'd love you to speak a little bit about, which is you traced your ancestry in a very, very rigorous way. I think 7 generations, if I'm not mistaken. Will you tell us why you were moved? Rohan just spoke to us about the sense of continuity and often the need to connect to an ancient past because it gives us a sense of legitimacy. And I wanted to know what fueled your search for some kind of origin story.
This question that Rohan raised, your children or your grandchildren or from my generation onwards, they will not know anything that I was born in high-tech city and I barely speak Telugu. It is that sort of signal that I responded to. Except that Rohan and I are a generation apart, so we responded differently, and anyway 2 people will always respond differently to the same stimulus. About 1985 or thereabouts, my father was alive, my uncles were alive, my grandfather were gone by then. It suddenly struck me that we'll not know where we came from, how the family came to where it is. And I thought it was important to leave. We are not very good at this in our country. We don't have church records. I don't even have a birth certificate. I don't know when CAA comes what I will do, but I'll figure that out.
It did last night. In effect, as of last night.
Yeah. But I then started to go and interview all the people who were old and my relations to find out about the family. And I took notes. We didn't have dictaphones in those days. They were all elderly, so soon after they died. So the joke in the family was, if Gopal comes to interview you, it's Yama's call, you'll soon be gone. Anyway, I had all this stuff with me, and I'm very fond of Higginbottoms in Mount Road. I collected a lot of books about the state of Madras presidency at the turn of the century. And I managed to trace I took one line of the family to 1823 from a small village in Tamil Nadu in Tanjore district. And I started imagining how life in the village must have been at that time. And then I started to write. And when I finished the manuscript, I thought I will put it on a word processor and leave it for my grandchildren. But somebody wanted to publish it. So Rupa published it. And we called it a comma in a sentence because for me the message was, in the English language, depending on where you put the comma, the meaning of the sentence can completely change. And while all of us lead commodity lives, one person in the family might lead a life, hopefully of virtue, which changes the trajectory of the family. And I think it's very inspiring to lead your life that way. For example, if you make a lot of money in a very short time through methods which are, I'm not sure your grandchildren would like to remember you. But if you've done something virtuous, intellectual, spiritual, something that is of a good character, then the family would like to remember you. So that's why I wrote the book, and I was very happy that a lot of other people read it. I was very interested, for example, and if I've got 2 minutes to just narrate the story. Okay, you're always utilitarian in your outlook. So you publish this book, X thousand people bought it, you get a few letters. I always, at the end of my book, write my email ID so that people can give me their call. I got a email from a small place in West Bengal. It is called Horibedo, somewhere near Asansol. And they got my telephone number, they rang me up and they said, we'd like you to come to this village to, we want to honor you at the temple. I said, me? You got the wrong guy. Here's the story now. To cut the long story short, I went there after some years. Around the time of Aurangzeb, a Tamil Brahmin, Iyengar, went from Kanchipuram on a pilgrimage by foot. On the way, and the people who went on such pilgrimages stayed at the temple. So he stayed at a temple in the Raja of Panchakot, which is near Asansol. The Raja was very impressed with the guttural voice of the priest who narrated, chanted the Vedas. So he asked him to come and be the priest at the temple. Since he had a commitment back in his village, he sent his brother. And around that, a community of Tamil Iyengars came up in West Bengal from the time of Aurangzeb. Now, I was amazed. The women are wearing their 9-yard sari better than my wife will wear it. They don't speak a word of Tamil, but they speak Bengali very fluently, which I also happen to speak because I was born and raised in Bengal. But their pottu, the tilak on the forehead, the way they wear their 9-yard sari, the way they do the arti in the temple. Now, there are hundreds of such examples. I've just happened to have quoted one. There's a community which has nothing to do with my book called Hussaini Brahmins in India. I don't know how many of you even know there's a Hussaini Brahmin. People who wear a skull cap, have their janeyu, and they do arti. And they observe Muharram. And the story behind them is that they went to fight in Karbala on behalf of Hussein, who honored them. And the best known Hussaini Brahmin is Sunil Dutt, the actor. So we are a great colloidal society of lots of ideas which are just sitting together side by side, each one keeping it. That's the definition of a colloidal chemistry. It doesn't go into solution, it doesn't precipitate, it sits uniformly dispersed through the one medium into the other. We are very lucky to have this society, and these are all small efforts to keep that going.
Thank you so much for your time.